Okay, thank you. So I'm Rajesh Heynickx. I'm working at two different institutions at the Faculty of Architecture, the former St. Lucas, the KU Leuven, and also I'm teaching art history at the University of Antwerp. So what I will do today in my paper is also talking about time and place and time in the architecture. And more specifically, I will delve into a phenomenon which fascinates me a lot already a long time. That's the hotel lobby. And the hotel lobby, we all know the hotel lobby by looking at films, but the hotel lobby is so fascinating because of two reasons, I think. It's on the one hand a sort of whirlpool where old identities are torn apart, people are checking in and getting a room number or are getting another identity because they want to have another identity. And on the other hand, there are also new identities coming around in the lobby because people are talking with each other, with people from abroad, etc. So there are two things going on in the lobby. On the one hand, torn apart things, and on the other hand, creating new things. On the other hand, so that is quite fascinating, but on the other hand, I'm fascinated by the link between literature and architecture, and not only because you can, for example, and it's perfectly possible to do it with, for example, Casa Malaparte, you can decode the typology of a house or a building, but you can also, and that's the thing I want to do today, you can also trace or track the relation between, on the one hand, literary imagination and architecture. So what I will do today is to bring in the notion of time into this phenomenon. There are two important, somewhat contradictory dimensions when you link the lobby with the notion of time. In the first place, the lobby is a place for passing through. So it has a very temporary, very fleeting character. People come and people go, but nothing really happens. That is what Dr. Ottrenschlag, a disfigured veteran of World War I, who was always sitting in the lobby, tells other people in the film Grand Hotel, the 1932 movie. But secondly, equally important, the lobby is also a sort of point where time is regulated and fixated. Just one example, in the shrinking modern world you could find timetables for trains in lobbies, as lobbies and railways were often built by the same companies. Companies who built railway stations were also building hotels. So you also have the expression "meet me under the clock," which was, for example, in 19th century San Francisco synonymous with a rendezvous in the lobby of the Western St. Francis. So we can say that in lobbies two things happen. On the one hand, you have different temporal regimes which are at work in one space, and one is punctuated by fleeting time, another by fixation. The second thing you can tell about, or say about the lobby, is that lobbies did and still do embody a sort of time-space compression. So hotels were important dots in shifting networks of centrality and peripherality responsible for the dissolution of old notions of time. Okay, that's a phenomenon. But by which mechanism did space and time got interwoven? What was the trait d'union in the lobby? And I think you have to look at the visitors of the lobby. The visitors or hotel guests who are sitting in the lobby's club chairs and were often socially isolated, broken molecules, as Richard Sennett called them. And I will call those people sitting in a lobby today with I will coin a new term, the term lobby lizards. The term lobby lizards first pops up in the 19th century American jurisdiction to denote unwanted hotel visitors. And later on it became a slang word for people hanging around, blending with the furniture, and most of all gazing at famous people who were sleeping in a hotel and might pop up in the lobby. But what I think it can be coined as a sort of heuristic device to understand the time-space compression. As Henri Lefebvre has demonstrated, with the advent of modernity at the end of the 19th century, time did vanish from social space. Yet lived space, space experienced and remembered by its users, does not stop to exist in people's thoughts, and most of all could be expressed in narrative structures. And also importantly, and I quote Lefebvre, this implies that the role of time is crucial. It is the perception of space in time that determines a person's experiences and memories of a certain place. End of quote. For example, in Thomas Mann's tiny novel Dead in Venice, Gustav von Aschenbach, an author in his early 50s, gets confused when he perceives, from his hotel, the horizon of the sea. The unbounded space causes problems, and I quote, an empty, undifferentiated space, or senses like the means to measure time, end of quote. Yet, so it turns out, a comprehensive understanding of the demanding complexity of the world's phenomena is possible in the lobby. You can measure time there, although you have to keep up the pose of an indifferent stranger, because everybody is alien to each other. You can still analyze and recognize the outside world there. Phenomenologically spoken, when Aschenbach gets another physical spatial outlook, he's able to connect in his consciousness space-time differently, and through that changing perception of reality, his mental inscape, daydreaming versus a secure social analysis, changes. As the Aschenbach character can prove, the lobby lizard can offer an entry to the time-space debate. His changing inscape can offer us an outlook. In that sense, the lobby lizard is a cousin of the more well-known flaneur. Just like the flaneur, the lobby lizard can be considered as a selective reader of the urban macrocosm, as a sign that refers to the microcosm of psychological meanings. Aschenbach is a famous lobby lizard. The same can be said of Siegfried Kracauer, whose essay on the lobby, written in the 1920s Berlin, when he was active as a journalist for the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung. That essay was truly eye-opening for my research on the lobby. I will not go into Kracauer here because it's well known how the essay is composed, but I think one basic attitude is quite crucial. One has to be a detective. The essay on the lobby was originally composed by Kracauer as a chapter in a study on the detective novel. So let's try to do some detective work today. I will look at a couple of, let's call them mugshots of lobby lizards in order to profile, to make a sort of profile of the temporal regime of the lobby as it can be detected in the lizard's urban narratives. And I will, more specifically, I will ask, how was the time-space compression, which was so dominant in the lobby, experienced, evoked, analyzed, and commented? So that's a bunch of questions, but I will look into two settings. In the first hand, I will look at Europe, and in a second part of the paper, I will very shortly look at the Orient. So first, Europe. In Joseph Roth's work, especially the 1932 novel The Radetzky Marsh, World War I is seen as a central catastrophe of modern civilization. Not so much because of the bloodshed, but because it caused the downfall of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which Roth considered to be the only home he ever had. The temporal regime of the old monarchy had been a unique one, Roth complained. And I quote, "Anything that grew took its time growing, and anything that perished took a long time to be forgotten. But everything that had once existed left its traces, and people lived on memories, just as they now live on the ability to forget quickly and empathically." End of quote. In the new era, Roth argued, time was not longer piled up in readable traces. Rapidness and consequently emptiness, Benjamin's Erfaringsarmut, dominated. Joseph Roth himself did not leave many traces. He had no fixed address, but lived in hotels throughout Europe until he died in Paris in 1939. This pronounced sense of homelessness came to a dramatic culmination in a 1937 essay describing the demolition of the Hotel Foyot in Paris. In this text, Roth tells how, opposite the bistro he had been sitting all day, the Hotel Foyot, you see on the left hotel, very close to the Parc de Luxembourg, so that the Hotel Foyot, where he had lived the past 16 years, was being pulled down, destroyed. His home away from home dissolved, and I quote, "Here I am sitting with my wondrous staff," end of quote. And I think there's one word which is quite important in this analysis Roth made at that day, that is sitting, a standstill. Joseph Roth was at the same time a perfect man for his era and perfectly unsuited to live in it. He can be called an intellectual transvaluator, someone who was condemned to fill the void of a desocialized and dehistoricized consciousness. Not unoften these homines novi of modern culture, the names are known, Peter Altenberg, Robert Musil or Sandor Marai, could be found working in bistros, coffee houses and also hotel lobbies where noise constantly challenged their concentration. Sitting at tiny tables, they defended, as Claudio Magris once remarked, an uncompromising individuality. For Magris, this stubborn will to survive in an age of melting certainties revealed a painful irony. At the moment they were desperately trying to evoke a lost world in their writings, the lobby lizards were being absorbed by the new world. And indeed, those who were sitting in hotel lobbies only had the illusion of marooning on a free, secure, even pressure-free island, somewhere on the other side of l'histoire immédiate. In fact, they were totally caught up in a sort of control revolution. Time in the hotel was molded by. International clocks on the walls and the hotel employees who had to be walking timetables to please the tourists generated a new order of logistics and new standards of hospitality, marked by the shift from what René Huygens, another lobby lizard, once called the shift from la pensée réfléchie to le réflexe organisé. Yet, although time was rationalized through compression and systematization in the hotel lobby, it could also become deliberately enlarged into a sort of mythologized imaginary while people were waiting. The lobbies did embody frozen moments in history. The neo-style's Greek pillars offered a safe harbor for those drifting on the urban sea. By installing this kind of temporal regime, lobbies could obtain a sensitive place in the psyche of many. They were dream castles, healing fairy tales, materializing in ceilings and furniture. The explanation that realized fantasies could become sites to escape into a dreamed past has much to do with the popular culture and especially Hollywood films. For example, in the already mentioned film Grand Hotel, in which a lobby is a key element, many social relations are marked by the rise of a modern scheme. Not an old aristocracy based on blood ties, but a speedy stenography, writing in shorthand, becomes the leading ideal. Whereas the Hollywood representation of the lobby lizard is quite well known, the fact that already in the interwar, specialists could differ enormously about the way time should be structured in the hotel and its lobby has received much less attention. In the 1920s and 1930s, hotel managers, subscribing theoristic principles in order to gain time, and on the other hand, psychologists figuring out which impression management was necessary to turn the lobby into a sort of new memory, did find each other in a project. Yet, although quite rarely, this type of time management could face fierce opposition. The fact that people were not welcomed but processed in the lobby did shock people. They did not like the new system of visible customs and invisible assumptions, codes and values which structured the timely perception of the lobby. What had happened to the old world, the domus, with no strict time policy? This was a question raised by a dandy and also a hotel manager at the same time, Paul Veling. Time to reflect, he complained about the loss caused by the hotel. Even that was not available. There was no time to reflect, so he sketches a sort of paradox. But he's able to sketch in a tiny book a sort of topography of the past, present and future, and consequently succeeds in analyzing what he calls the deep structures of time, which were no longer available in a society which was changing so rapidly, and even in the Grand Hotel, the lobby, which could be a sort of new memory, this was also no place to keep up with time. To be short, the lobby lizard can be called a nostalgic being and even a melancholic being. Even a very negative reflection on rapidness, the delirium of time he is absorbed by, is impossible. The complex fusion of rest and speed in the lobby is a very vulnerable one, and even can become, for the lobby lizard, a metaphor of a world in transit. He looks at from the inside. So, the setting of lobby lizards type number 2 is a new world, that is the Orient, or better, a rather unknown, exotic world. Here, the lobby lizard is not witnessing the often painful metamorphosis of a well-known world, but looking forward to the luring excitement of the exotic experience of a new world with other temporal regimes and other time experiences. But which scenario is unfolding when we do look at lobby lizards and grand hotels in the Orient? But first, maybe those two pictures to give an impression of the time regime which was installed in lobbies. This is the Willet lobby in Washington, D.C., which is one of the oldest lobbies in the world, and which is also the place where the new term of the lobbying came into being, because an American president, Grant, was always sitting in the lobby and he was always harassed by people asking him a lot of things, and he complained at a certain moment, all those people lobbying here. And so this is the origin of the word lobbying as a sort of negotiating, of getting something from somebody. But what is interesting to have a look at the Willet lobby in Washington is that indeed you have this kind of structure which is based on beams out of steel, but they are wrapped up by a sort of plaster to give a sort of Greek connotation and to create columns. So this is a sort of regime which is at work. On the one hand you have those timetables in those lobbies, on the other hand they are trying to keep track of time and even to create a new myth. But let's go to the other side, to the world which is in flames today, to Egypt, and to the hotels which were there a sort of hubs in this kind of expanding network of tourist networks, which were hubs for the Western people, Western tourists. So which scenario is unfolding when we do look at lobby lizards in grand hotels in, for example, Egypt. There's in the first place a sort of similarity with hotels on the old continent. One can find in the lobby a sort of secure atmosphere. As André Malraux noticed in his 1960s memoirs, and I quote, "In the old days, going to Asia meant slowly entering time and space alike," end of quote. And in that process, the lobby offered a sort of much needed and even essential standstill, a moment of escape, a refuge. Architectonically, the lobby of Western hotels in Orient were eclectic ensembles. Swiss chalet ornamentation could meet Gothic arcades here. This led to a sort of shared past where one was away from home, but still sitting in a sort of welcome heaven. But at the same time, it offered, and that was noted by another author, and the famous one of Moby Dick, Herman Melville, he noted that lobbies in the Orient were a sort of, and I quote, "a brilliant scene, sitting in the own past, the old dreams of Europe, glass-stained windows with medieval motifs were no exception in those hotels. One could explore a deep past, the Egyptian past." Egypt, for example, became in the first decades of the 20th century a sort of open-air museum. And hotels, and that's very remarkable to see that in a lot of writings of lobby lizards, were often seen or perceived as counterparts of musea. So this is, for example, the Shepherd's Hotel in Cairo, which was for most Western people in the first decades of the 20th century a sort of synonymous with Cairo. You go to the Shepherd's, so there you find all the Western stuff, etc. in the lobby. But most interesting is that people who were sitting in the lobby were planning their trips to the pyramids and to the Dead Valley, etc. So they were hiring here, for example, mules and cars to go into the Egyptian deep past. So you get a sort of empty room in the lobby to go to a deeper past. So, for example, in the Shepherds in Egypt, which was identified with Cairo and Egypt, one hotel manager wrote bitterly, and I quote, "The tourists of the world come here seem to be racing against time to reach the Shepherd's lobby," end of quote. And indeed, the Shepherd is a sort of hub or container. After breakfast, you could go to the deep past. We can learn much of the lobby lizard by looking at this kind of biosphere, but it can also be interesting to look at the criticism which was created around this phenomenon of the lobby lizard and people getting in those on those tourist tours. And you could say it's interesting to look at what we can call a sort of anti-lizard, anti-lobby lizard, the criticism of time traveling. And one of the most interesting examples of someone who was really having a lot of problems with people gathering around in lobbies was the French author Pierre Loti, who was a novelist but also a naval officer, and you could also call him an anti-lizard. He hated the hotels and stressed the fact that they disturbed the past. And I quote, "Winter Palace of Winter Palace, un hâtif produit du modernisme qui a germé au bord du Nil," end of quote. Hotels and tourists are perceived as a spreading disease. The lobby is described as a source of infection, namely a fragmented and too modernized, therefore too alienated view on the past. And Loti, the guy you see here, he was himself visiting musea with candlelight because he was against the electricity of the hotels, and he promoted a sort of parallel with the past. And at a certain moment he discovered that the features of Ramses II were very comparable with his own physiognomy, and he made a picture of it and he made a sort of postcard of it and he sent it to all his friends in distress. There was some similarity. But the most interesting thing here is that his argument is you can touch the past. So there's a sort of haptic argument that you have to get in touch with the past, and those lobby visits, those hotel tourists, they were alienating. They were not touching the past, and that is for him quite important. So you can learn a lot of the lobby visit by looking at those guys who were making comments on it. Okay, I will come to a couple of conclusions. In an article in New York Times called "The Hotel Lobby as a Public Utility," published on September 1922, the Marxist journalist Eugene Lyons started with a prediction, and I quote, "Some seventh of the future will win immortality by an earnest study of hotel anatomy, and more specifically of the genesis and growth of the hotel lobby," end of quote. As a Marxist, Lyons was most of all astonished by the fact that the lobby was what he called a baffling social hybrid. Yet, the scholar who wants to become the seventh Lyons dreams about in 1922 has to distinguish a number of hybrid dimensions, circling around the dichotomy acceleration, relaxation. What I have tried to demonstrate today by delving in the field notes of lobby lizards is that the lobby joins and separates spaces and times. It is a sort of entre-deux. Moreover, to understand the public-private polarity, as in the case of the Hotel Mensch God, or the tension between European and non-European time, the Lotti case, the dissection of temporal regimes is essential. The thoughts and actions of lobby lizards have to be fleshed out. But underneath all these hinges, an important, still often forgotten polarity is present, the one between inscape and outlook, which can, but not necessarily, be coterminous with the act of waiting, the standstill in the club chairs, and movement, or as a Dutch journalist reporting on hotels wrote in 1920, the continually whooshing noise acts as a thought-damping narcotic, end of quote. But the question remains, why are these perceptions, these moments originating in the lobby's club chairs, this kind of restless stillness, not picked up and unfolded? And I think the answer can be quite easy. In some way, historiography also became in the grip of a sort of narcotic, that of suddenness and shock. Parallel with the rise of modernism studies, we all have become fascinated by modernity's constant flux and have forgotten the central role of the psychology of waiting, of standstill, which was embedded in a process of melting certainties. Waiting and lingering in a city, sitting down and killing time, generated a liminal sensitivity, even double consciousness we are not really used to read. Lobby lizards did sit between two seas of time. So this places us for the complexity of studying interiors, which is, and trust me, despite all fancy readers published today, still an emerging field. What we need in order to track and understand all dichotomies present in the lobby, departing from important phenomena as the erasure of time, movement, lobby is perceived as a passage, and storing of time, historicizing, the lobby becomes a sort of totem, is a truly unified architectural theory. One that entails at the same time a sort of phenomenological perspective, and that also a sort of thing theory. Whereas in 1981, Mary Ann Coase tried to train the literary eye so that it, and I quote her, might perceive inner structures and relations and relate them to its own complex knowledge and experience and to the outer text, end of quote, so we need a sort of architectural eye.